Hi, I'm Johanna Weaver, and you're listening to Tech Mirror. This week, we're bringing you a discussion that we recorded as part of NetThing 2022. NetThing is Australia's internet governance forum, and its theme this year was More Resilient Together. It focuses on how we as a community, that is civil society, industry and government, can work together to maintain an internet that is open, resilient and interoperable. On the panel, I was joined by Kate Pounder, the CEO of the Tech Council of Australia, and Richard Windeyer, the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts. We talked about how to get tech regulation right in Australia. And given the recent string of high-profile data breaches here, I think tech regulation is front of mind for many Australians in a way that it just hasn't been before. And in our conversation, we talk about a report that the Tech Policy Design Centre released a few months back, Tending the Tech Ecosystem. And in this report, we flipped the question. Instead of asking what should be the tech regulations, we asked who should be the tech regulators. This report was informed by interviews with heads of Australian regulators, senior public servants, industry executives, and also a comparative study of how regulators are organising themselves in 14 jurisdictions globally. In the discussion we're bringing you today, we talk about some of the findings from the report, and we draw out Richard and Kate's views on many of these key issues. Kate and Richard, when we focus on how to design effective tech regulation, it's easy to lose sight of the objective of the regulation. So I really wanted to start our discussion today by asking each of you, what would Australia look like if we got tech regulation right? How would citizens, industry and government be impacted if we actually manage to create a tech ecosystem that is effectively regulated? Kate, let's start with you.
It's a fabulous question, Johanna, because I think we can sometimes lose sight of the end goal, particularly when we're dealing with a stressful time such as we are now with the recent cyber hacks. And so I think that if we get this right, we'll be a country that feels it's in control of its future, feels it's in control of the jobs it's creating and who gets into them, feels we're in control of being able to create these new industries and companies that can go confidently in the world and build products and services that we're proud of, as well as making us a stronger and more resilient and successful company. And I think we'll be a citizenry that feels sort of enabled and capable of building and using those products and services. And that's often where regulation comes in. And I like to think that we need to sort of turn both through regulation but through all the other levers available to us, some of our what feels like vulnerabilities now into strengths. Like, we're a nation of tech adopters. It's actually one reason we're being targeted through these cyber hacks. But that should be our strength as well, right? Because technology can help keep us safe, both through the quality of the products that we're building and the services and websites that we're building, but also through the way we use technology, whether that's digital identity and credentials or simpler technologies like encryption and 2FA, to be helping us build a really resilient economy that's on the front foot. And that doesn't have to stop engaging with data and digital services because we feel that it's become a danger. So I think if we get the balance right, that's the kind of future we can have.
Yeah, and I love that concept, Kate, of if we get tech regulation right, we're actually controlling Australia's future. So Richard, over to you to help us paint that vision.
Well, I'll start by saying I really like the way Kate has presented it or described it, because I think that resonates with me. And in fact, the thing that I think was most telling in the way Kate described it is the first half of our answer didn't actually talk about tech at all. It talked about consumers and confidence and goods and services rather than tech. And I suppose the point I'd make, at one grandiose level, I would say if we get it right, then hopefully Australia's national interests are protected, consumers feel safe and markets work. And I sort of have those three dimensions because it does seem to me that we regulate for a lot of different purposes, and that's worth keeping in mind as well, whether it's economic regulation or consumer protection regulation or even sort of national security or national interest regulation. They're all often different, separate, sometimes overlapping, but not always overlapping buckets. And I think one of the other things that I feel, if we get it right, is that our citizens, Australians, can kind of concentrate and focus on the digital services they are receiving rather than worrying about the tech underlying them that is causing them to be delivered. And that's just a less elegant way, I think, of pointing to Kate's confidence, kind of confidence piece. So I think, I mean, and you will hear me probably mention this, say this a few times, Johanna, today, and I think you and I, and certainly Kate and I, talked about this in the past. For me, the huge amount of this is actually working out what we mean by, or what tech reg actually is versus what, you know, actually contemporary 21st century regulation of a whole lot of sectors looks like, which just happen to be sectors that are now quite digitally rich or tech heavy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that idea of regulating for many different purposes and the idea of people being able to focus on the services that are delivered rather than the tech that underpins them is also a really great way to articulate the objective. And I always say that tech policy is actually just policy, or tech regulation is actually just regulation. So definitely of one mind there. To those who are listening, if you do have questions as we're going through, please feel free to put them into the question function, and I'll try and inject them into the panel in an interactive way, so you don't have to wait to the end. So please feel free to use that, the Q&A function that is there. So when we now turn to looking at the findings of the report, Tending the Tech Ecosystem, one of the things that we were looking at was, what are the skills, knowledge and expertise that you would need to have to actually be an effective tech regulator? I'll talk about what the findings of the report are, but before I reveal the findings, I mean, people, I know Kate and Richard, you're at its launch, so you know the answers, you've got the exam question in advance. But I would love to just hear from both of you what you think the characteristics of an effective regulator to be able to achieve that vision that both of you have just articulated there. Richard, I'll throw to you first.
Thanks. So again, I'll sort of pose a question back and then come to the question. But one of the things that went through my mind thinking about this is kind of what are the skills and attributes you want for a regulator versus what are the skills, you know, if we talk about a tech regulator, what are the regulatory skills you need as well as the tech skills you need? And it's a question that I think we in government do grapple with frequently when we're looking for people to be regulators of the telecommunications sector, for example. To what extent do you bias towards people who are experienced regulators who will learn how telecommunications markets and systems work versus people that have expertise in the telecommunications world and they come into government and learn how to be a regulator? And I think that is actually a tricky balance to get right. And I think one of the things I would say is that it's perhaps one of the strengths in having regulators who are not individual people. They are part of a board or an authority or a commission that therefore can blend a variety of bits of expertise. Because being a regulator is a you know, there are a whole lot of skills associated with making decisions in a regulatory sense that are technically in their own right, let alone the skills or knowledge you might need for the sector you are being asked to regulate. The next thing I suppose I'd say, I mean, one way of looking at it perhaps is I would like to see people that are by nature able to be focus on outcomes, able to be collaborative both across government and across industry and across co-regulators, understand the need to be accountable, and that's actually sort of a regulatory, that's a kind of regulator skill, but particularly perhaps have an attitude which is willing to countenance change and change in the future. A couple of other things, though, I think I would add is when it comes to some things in the world of tech or some things in the world of digital, one of the features that I think is quite relevant is we end up talking about businesses that are global in nature and delivery of goods and services which don't necessarily, or services that don't necessarily are not easily stopped at a territorial border. And so one of the things I think is important in the digital world is an eye to where we fit, an eye to Australia's place in the world, or an eye to where our regulatory decisions and even our regulatory frameworks fit with respect to those in other countries that are grappling with the same problems and dealing with the same industry players. The question that I don't have a great answer to this. I mean, hopefully Kate can answer this. Is the sort of blessed question of how much do you need to be able to produce the clever algorithm in order to be able to regulate the things that the clever algorithm delivers? And I think that's really, really hard to work out what the right blend is. Can you just regulate, what things can you regulate by focusing on outcomes and behaviours rather than having to regulate the things that go into the system? Safety regulators, traditionally, you would expect to understand how cars work and how planes work in order to regulate them safely. But other things you can regulate by looking at the outcome and say, your challenge is to run your business to produce the right outcomes, not the wrong outcomes. I don't have to design your algorithm for you. That's the piece that I think is tricky to know how to get right, because the challenge, and then the challenge is where do you find the people that that potentially tick all those boxes? Kate will have the answer.
Thanks, Richard. So I will throw to Kate. These were some of the topics that were much discussed in the report as well, but I'll let Kate jump in before I speak to the report.
Thank you. And look, I would firstly agree with everything Richard said in terms of the qualities you need in the regulator. I think you do need people who have a range of expertise within the regulator, but not every individual has to be able to fulfill each piece of expertise. That's an impossible ask, but it's being thoughtful about the team you're creating and the staff and the board or the commission model that you have in those agency structures. I actually think in some ways, though, to also echo Richard's point, it's the mindset, and the skills, not simply the knowledge. I think being really good at problem solving, particularly knowing how to navigate the levers of government and the workings of government, and knowing, the rules you have to follow and the times when you need to actually come up with new solutions. I actually think that's an incredibly important judgment call often, but it's so critical in our space because so often it's not simply a procedural and enforcement-based regulation. You're actually constantly being confronted with a new problem that there's no rule book for. So that creativity and that problem solving is actually a really important quality, I think. But knowing, the bounds within which you can exercise that discretion and when to develop new rules and when to follow and enforce the rules that apply, and knowing how to interpret them. And I think that point on collaboration, engaging with stakeholders is really key, because often you basically have to solve the problem together to an extent, because no one has perfect knowledge of what's happened or the technologies or the rules. So you can't have a model where there isn't collaboration. To Richard's point, though, and I think it's a really good one, do you need to have built something to know how to take it apart and understand it and regulate it? I can only speak from personal experience, and I am, by no means a technical person in my training, but I did actually work as a regulator in the first part of my career, and then went and worked in consulting, but also for Data 6.1 for a period. And I've got to say, I didn't actually build an algorithm, but having to sit in meetings with data scientists where I was the partner responsible for a data analytics project, and I had to really understand the choices we were making in the data, the complexities, has made me a much better policy thinker, because sometimes I can look at a piece of legislation and say, yeah, I know we haven't described, I know the policy outcome we're trying to achieve, and I can see we're not describing it correctly. Or, in this current debate about data, I think it's an irony that in the same week we're all becoming increasingly concerned about the amount of data that's being collected by the private sector, the Parliament's passing a piece of legislation that will massively expand the rights of the ATO to force a lot of companies to be collecting a whole range of private data. And I think the only reason no one's put two and two together is no one really appreciates what the legislation that's passing on that second point is doing. And so I think when you've worked with that technology and on it, it doesn't mean you have to be a data scientist. You can, I think, understand something, particularly when it's not presented to you in a clear way more readily, and that's an important skill. But not everyone in the regulator needs to have it.
Yeah, and folks won't be surprised to know that this was a really key part of the discussion that in all of the interviews that we conducted. And it was probably one of the main parts of the report where there was divergence of views. There were a number of the interviewees who felt that a regulator wouldn't be able to actually regulate effectively in this space unless they were able to have that level of expertise. And then the divergence really came from the point of, did that expertise need to be in-house, or would it be possible for the regulators to obtain that expertise elsewhere? And what my team is currently doing at the moment is finalising a revised model focused on coordination, which is looking at internationally global best practice in terms of how do you actually pull in that expertise when there is an information and knowledge asymmetry sitting, and it's not just with regulators, but also with policymakers. What are some mechanisms that we can put in place to actually help to address that in a really practical sense? And that's part 2 of the report, which is coming soon. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of other things that Kate and Richard spoke about there. Outcomes-focused regulatory toolkit was something that had absolutely unanimous support from everybody that we interviewed. And the need for there to be multidisciplinary skills within regulators was also something. This idea that you do need people who can understand tech, whether they can build the algorithms, that's the conversation we've just had, but at least have that base level of understanding. And I think the example Kate just gave there is a really good one. But then there was also a lot of the people that we interviewed who emphasized that you actually need to understand regulatory craft as well, and how government works. This is some of the things that both Richard and Kate had emphasized. One thing that also jumped out to us, and I'd be really interested, particularly from the NetThing community, on your thoughts and views on this. But one thing that really stood out was it didn't matter whether the interviewees that we had discussed the questions with were from government, from industry, or from civil society. Everyone we spoke to in the field has a really strong sense of purpose about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I think this is something that we can actually harness more efficiently and more effectively to drive good regulatory outcomes. And I know a lot of that passion and purpose sits within the NetThing community. So I would be particularly interested if any of you have views on how we might better harness that passion and purpose. The international dimension was something that came out as well, just to flag for people. One of the other major projects of work that my team is working on is a global tech policy atlas, which we'll be launching within a month, which is looking at bringing together different attempts to regulate globally. We have a database that is currently sitting at about 3,800 records for over 40 countries. We're really excited to unleash that onto the world to help sort of provide a central starting point for people who are looking at exactly what Richard was talking about there, about what can we learn from others. And then the one other thing that had universal support on this question was about business models, that if we are going to be an effective regulator in this space, that they need to understand the business models by which the tech sector operates within, to understand the levers and incentives that are available. And I noticed one of the questions that has been put up in the Q&A is saying that often regulation is focused on regulating bad behavior, but should we be also focused on incentivizing good behavior? I think that does in part go to this question of, do we actually need to have a better understanding as regulators, as policymakers, of what drives tech business models? But then how do we actually build that expertise, that understanding of tech business models? Because they are quite different from other business models that exist sort of more traditionally within the Australian economy. So Kate, I might throw that question to you first and then across to Richard.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. I think it's, I mean, ultimately, when you're a regulator, you've got an outcome you're trying to achieve, and your goal is to really work out the best way to achieve that outcome. And I think because business models can be quite varied in the sector, and because they can change over time, if you're not acquainted with them, it's harder to know whether your policies are working and you're achieving the outcome, or whether the outcome might need to change because of the world has changed. So how to do it? I think engaging with stakeholders is really important, and building up your personal affinity and knowledge with the sector. And, that can be through reading and podcasts and things, attending conferences and seminars, but, probably more than anything else, just going out and talking to people in the sector, I think also can really help. That's personally what I do a lot with my members, just to stay current. I think though it's also taking a step back, because if I can give you an example, the government at the moment has a critical industries list, effectively a critical tech list, but it's sort of defaulted sometimes to being the things you need to regulate to protect Australia. Whereas I think you can flip it around and also think about the things that can make our economy stronger. And, I've thought about thinking it like a regulatory offset model, or a budget offset model, where if say at the moment we're introducing visa screening for all of these industries and roles in them, which is it's moving, it was legislated last year and we're putting it through. I'm like, why not? I mean, ministers also have direction powers about prioritising the types of industries or jobs that should be prioritised in the skills migration system. Why wouldn't we just issue a ministerial direction also prioritising processing roles in any of these critical tech industries? Because that will mitigate some of the impact of extra visa screening. And I think at the moment with the cybersecurity you're seeing, it's evidencing that when you have really deep skill shortages in software engineers and cybersecurity professionals across the economy, it actually becomes a real vulnerability. So we could sort of fix that problem by doing a sort of simultaneous ministerial direction that would both prioritise it, but also add this, important protective visa screening layer. So I think just taking that mindset of this can be something that benefits us, it can be something that's a vulnerability, how are we constantly maximising for both, is another way of not having to know everything, but still kind of bringing it back to the outcome.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more about the critical tech list, Kate. I think often the focus is on protecting, and the thing that I would like to emphasize is that actually by promoting the industry, there is an element of protecting that can be built into it as well, so that it works both ways. Richard, from your perspective, do you find it difficult to understand the tech business models? What are the strategies that you and your department are using to gain that level of understanding, to understand the levers at your disposal?
So, I mean, in some respects, it's exactly the same sorts of things that Kate was talking about. You do need to, I mean, what I'd say perhaps is to expand business models slightly to also understand whatever the digital equivalent of a supply chain is becomes the other part of it, it seems to me, because I think it's a question of making sure you know enough to be able to think about how incentives might or might not work, and to be able to work out what's the right place to focus your intervention, which might, be further up a chain, for example, rather than at the last consumer-facing endpoint potentially. So I think for me, there's both the sort of supply chain piece as well as the individual business model piece. Both are important to understand. And to be honest, I mean, it's not, as I say, it's not rocket science. You kind of do just have to make a concerted effort to be out talking to people. The key thing in a way is to do that in the quiet times. What's really hard to do is to kind of do that when you're in the process of trying to regulate, or when you're in the process of trying to write the law. It's easier to get, I mean, in fact, slightly going back to the last question, it's probably easier to get the regulated sector itself to help policymakers than it is to get them to help regulators, because you're not, there comes a point where you don't want to incriminate yourself with a regulator potentially, but there is, so sometimes we've got perhaps an advantage in the policy making world over a regulator, because people are happy to help and talk early to try and shape sensible legislative or regulatory frameworks that we're putting in place. It's can be too late once the law's in place and the regulator's forced to enforce it, and it's complicated for regulators when there's an issue underway. So early engagement in the quiet times, I think, is key. A couple of other points I'd mention sort of related to this. One is that when you're thinking about regulation, one of the tools that's worth making sure you've got in your regulatory schemes is appropriate information gathering powers for, and even in the telco sector, for example, we've got a whole lot of record keeping powers. But so you can actually give the capacity for regulators to be able to get access to information to help them with their decision making. You don't always want to go to it, but sometimes even the formal information gathering powers are quite useful, I think, on both sides. They're useful for regulators, and they're potentially useful for industry sectors who would be reluctant to voluntarily hand over information. But if there's a formal regulatory process to require it, then that sometimes, not in all instances, might make it easier. But so there are things you can do in regulatory frameworks themselves that are helpful. I think I made the point about supply chains, which is probably a clunky bit of language, but it does. The other point I suppose I'd go to, and picking up some of what Kate talked about, is Kate's description of things with the critical tech stuff and the visa stuff kind of just points out that unfortunately government is often messy, and choices about whether you view an issue through a migration and skills lens versus a national security sovereign interest lens are choices that we're always juggling, I think, in government, and are interesting to try and navigate. And I mean, I think even if you look at some of the stuff going on recently, whether we're looking at what happened with Optus and what happened with Medibank have been seems to me discussed publicly in different ways, or commentated on in different ways. And there's almost been, because Optus is a telecommunications company, and because telecommunications companies are critical infrastructure companies, and because there's critical infrastructure legislation, should we be looking at that through a critical infrastructure lens? Or alternatively, you can look at it through a sort of data breach, privacy, data security, so there are choices that government have to make and weigh up. And I think that's something that is important for people in government to be to have in mind, that there are often choices in there. And look, the final point, I mean, I actually, the critical tech point that you've both made, I think I agree with. I mean, and I think, the discussions, the intention, or some of the intention behind thinking about critical tech, was as much working out what's important, that in a sense presents opportunity for Australia, as it is about, it's sort of, the way I sort of think about it is we're trying to identify things that are critical for Australia and Australians' prosperity, but also might be things that others think are critical to prosperity, and therefore may well be opportunities, if we've got strength in them, to harness, cultivate, and promote, rather than all being things that are, rather than a presumption that all of the critical tech things, for example, don't start here in Australia, I suppose is the point. And I just think sometimes, I agree, some of the discussion around this can occasionally get confused or lose sight of the fact that there are sort of things the critical bit doesn't mean we've got to worry. It might mean that there's an opportunity before us that we should consider.
Yeah, absolutely, Richard. One very quick fire question for you. You mentioned that we should be doing consultations during the quiet time. Do you guys ever have any quiet time? When I was in government, there never was.
There's not quiet time, but there is time when, and no, there's not a lot of quiet time, but there is time when you don't have an issue.
Yes.
Now is not the time to go and consult closely with a whole lot of industry players on what to do about data security in their business, because everyone's going to be in the midst of trying to work out, is it me next? What's the law doing for me? How liable am I? What am I going to have to do when something goes wrong? But it's almost, there's actually a sort of call out here for industry and others, as well as a reminder for government, coming to talk to government, or us getting out to talk to people when there's no set agenda, there's no obvious reason why now is the time to talk, is often the best time to say we can have a sort of without prejudice discussion to understand what's going on. And unfortunately, oftentimes we haven't done that, and we get to the point where the discussion is going to be a little bit more constrained because we're doing it in light of an intention to legislate a regulatory decision before us, an incident's occurred, and we're kind of scrambling to come up the curve and close an information asymmetry, or even just to kind of get each other on a common page. Much easier if you can do that in a quiet time. But it's a little bit of a reminder or a comment from people like me to make sure I'm doing it, but also a call out to industry to say, you know, knocking on the door of government to say, hey, we're kind of interested in letting you know who we are and what we do, or here's something we're working on, not because you want anything from government or not because you're expecting government signal that wants to hear from you, is actually worthwhile doing. And hopefully people in my sorts of jobs, you know, accept those offers to come and have a chat willingly rather than saying, no, now's not the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, this idea of having, it came out a lot in the discussions that we had and in the report, was the idea of non-transactional, non-adversarial forums for conversation between government, industry and civil society. And I saw that's a theme in some of the comments or questions that have been raised. It's also a question we'll touch on towards the end of the session. So we'll just put a flag down that we'll come back to that point. I want to talk a little bit about coordination among regulators and policymakers, and then we'll move on to talk about with the external parties. One of the two questions that we really focused on in the report was, first was the skills and attributes, which we've touched on. The second was really looking at this question of, do we need a different regulatory structure given that the tech sector is growing, it's important, it's embedded, is the way that we're regulating actually the best way to regulate? And the question we put to our interviewees was, do we need to create a super tech regulator? Do we need to upskill our existing regulators? Do we need to have some kind of hybrid of the both? Or is there a fourth option that we haven't thought of that is a much more creative option that would actually be a better option? And what was really interesting to me is that not one single interviewee argued for a super tech regulator. And let me be clear, I personally think a super tech regulator is a terrible idea, but I was surprised that no one that we interviewed was in favour of that. And so the focus of the discussion then really turned to, okay, if we're not going to have a super tech regulator, and largely the argument against that was if you were doing that to prevent silos, and Richard, you were talking about the different choices that are made across government. Are we looking at this in a critical tech perspective? Are we looking at it from a data, from a privacy, or, you know, I would add directors' duties, corporate responsibility, these types of things as well. So in an attempt to create a super regulator that tries to break down those silos, then you would actually be creating new silos that would be, okay, so tech regulation is happening over here, but what about privacy for stuff that is offline? Where would that now fit? And so the idea is, or the suggestions from those that we interviewed was, we need to actually upskill our existing regulators to be able to address and look at these issues, because tech regulation is just going to become regulation. And then we also need to increase the coordination between regulators and, importantly, between regulators and policymakers. Because one of the interesting things that we heard from the regulators that we interviewed was that there is often a situation where regulations are developed by the policy agencies and then given to the regulators to implement, and the regulators say, look, this is actually really hard. This is not implementable. And so how do we increase the coordination between the regulators and the policymakers? So, I mean, Kate, you prior to in a couple of lives ago, you worked within a regulatory environment. So you bring some experience to this as well. I'm interested in your thoughts on whether or not you agree that we need enhanced coordination among policymakers and regulators, and how do you think is the best way to go about facilitating that coordination and cooperation? And then we'll throw it to Richard.
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's one I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And as you said, I don't think there's a perfect answer. I think that's the first thing. It's not one super regulator, not one model, right? Different models will work better for different regulators and departments and questions. I think that if I could, in some ways where I would start by solving this is working out what is the most important gap now, because there actually are a lot of regulators who are already in groups, already talking to each other and working with people. So what is the one gap that I think we haven't solved at the federal level? And I think that's around assurance, around the design of data regulation and programs, as well as more broadly AI. If I look around all the regulators and I see what are we struggling with a bit as we're responding to the cybersecurity hack and those related issues, if we're introducing digital identity, like where is the one regulator that we don't have, or the one regulated body? I think it's around that convergence of those data and AI policy and design issues, because they're relatively new, because a lot of these other regulatory functions pre-existed as we've digitized, but they're a sort of newer area. So the model that I think, though, that has best solved this, that I'm really, really excited by, is the New South Wales Government AI and Data Assurance Framework, and the fact that they've put in place an independent assurance group. And I think, what I would love to see practically at the federal level is something like a model which said, if you're introducing a piece of legislation or designing a program which is likely to have a major data collection or data use or AI component, that's not just like very off the shelf and straightforward, the first thing you need to do as you're thinking about this is a privacy impact assessment. So there might be multiple other assessments, but I think a PIA and even cybersecurity. And that should form part of that initial policy making. And then you don't, in some ways, have to go and reinvent new forums, because there are already processes for doing those kind of things. It's just we don't necessarily do them by default at that early policy stage. And I think what would be good to establish, though, is at the federal level, a similar independent expert group to assure data and AI regulation and programs and policies, because then again, it will create a model reasonably familiar to governments, but it's if anyone across the public service is working on these issues, you've now got a place where you can take your planned policy, your planned program, and you can get expert feedback on it. You can have a good framework, because the New South Wales framework includes privacy, security, fairness, transparency, a lot of those policy issues. And you can get that expert feedback at an early stage. And then as you're designing it, whether it's law, whether it's a program, you can similarly go back at different stage gates. And I think something like that would solve a lot of the current pain points. And would just be a really good starting point at the federal level.
Thanks, Kate. We'll come back to that proposal as well. It's something that we have been focused on and doing a lot of work on. Before I respond to that specific point, I wanted to give Richard the opportunity to just talk about the need for greater coordination between policymakers and regulators.
It's an age-old problem, and in a sense, it's a problem with it. There's another way it's described across government, which is for example, in another context, the relationship between policymakers and service delivery agencies, for example, where you have exactly the same thing. You've got well-intentioned people producing public policy ideas, resulting in new legislative frameworks that then are handed over to service delivery agencies to try and implement or explain to people, and they turn out to be much more complicated than you first thought. And we policymakers just haven't taken into account all the enormous variety of permutations and combinations that might be around. So, I think it's an age-old problem, and absolutely one that we need to keep, we need to kind of work on. And as Kate said, there isn't an easy answer to it. I think we're getting, I think the sort of observation I would make is it's also worth thinking about, it's a combination of crisscrossing need for coordination. There's coordination between regulators across slightly different domains. There's coordination between the regulator and their natural home policy agency. And then there's coordination between a variety of policy agencies. And then the question is whether those lines can go diagonally as well between a comms regulator and an agricultural policy department, for example. But I think there are lots of dimensions worth where that consultation or common understanding of what we're trying to do is worth pursuing. I mean, the question that I think inevitably arises in this, I mean, I think your report sort of calls this out. You have to ask, it seems to me at some point you've got to ask the question, when you're looking at a fintech business, are you looking, when do you emphasize the fin and when do you emphasize the tech? Or when you're looking at an ag tech business, when do you emphasize the ag versus when do you emphasize the tech? And I think that's going to be a thing we're going to be judging. And when does a non-fintech company that's in the financial world start getting treated because they're using an awful lot of data and they're collecting an awful lot of information, begin to be seen as a fintech company? It's like, it's a sort of interesting distinction that's emerged in a whole lot of areas of an online retail store as a tech company, and a bricks and mortar store is a bricks and mortar store that might have an online retail service. And I think even our language, I think, is still, evolving to kind of work out when those things have begun to combine. So, I mean, that's not very helpful. It just suggests it's complicated. I would also say, though, it is worth making sure we don't overcomplicate the problem and assume absolutely everyone has to be constantly coordinating with everyone else. The spectrum of regulatory tasks and policy tasks is pretty broad and they don't all overlap. So, consumer regulation, consumer protection regulation at one end and national interest regulation at the other, for example, don't have to collide all the time. But on the consumer protection front, there are lots of regulators that might have an interest. And the other dimension that I think is worth keeping in mind, and this goes a little bit to thinking about Kate's AI assurance piece, is bearing in mind when we're talking about regulation for the purposes of trying to design or prevent bad things happening, so sort of design and shape an industry as it emerges. At the most extreme end, that becomes systems where we license people to operate, versus regulations which are all about, and the role of regulators to help shape industries emerge versus the role of regulators to sort of investigate, punish and fine people who have broken the law. And again, they're different, or the role of regulators to be able to intervene and help protect people from a harm that might have just occurred, or reduce, prevent the amplification or the continuing perpetuation of a harm. And I think all of those can be relevant in a sector. I mean, I see it in my world that is relevant if you think about online content. We've got a chunk of stuff designed to try and prevent certain types of content being made available. We've got laws that don't mean there are sort of criminal offences associated with some online content being available. And then we've got regulators with powers to help take content down, not because we're suggesting it was illegal to have it up there so much as because it's about protecting the victim or a person that was feeling harm. So all of those dimensions begin to weave into it, which suggests obvious need to coordinate between different types of regulators who are all looking at the same space, but perhaps at a different point around an incident, shall we say. Is it an agency that's got an interest in trying to prevent an incident in the first place? Is it an agency that's got an interest in what to do when an incident occurs? Or is it an agency that's got a responsibility or an expectation to see if someone was at fault and should be, held to account for contributing to the incident occurring? I don't know that really answers the question, but it's complicated.
It certainly gives us a lot of food for thought, and I think this concept of the regulators coordinating among themselves, obviously since we've published the report, actually just before we published the report, but after we did the interviews, the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, the DP Reg in Australia, Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum is the UK version, but Australia established a cooperation forum among the digital regulators, so digital platform regulators, but it doesn't include organisations like ASIC or APRA, who have a regulatory function which includes a large digital and tech mandate. So that's one of the things that we're looking at in part 2 of the report. I think also to your point, Richard, about the many different types of regulators and their different intents and purposes. When we're looking at regulatory design, for me, one of the things that this always comes back to is if we are giving these powers to regulators, are we ensuring that we have inbuilt into the powers for the regulators, the checks and balances on the power that they are being given. And I think this is really what distinguishes Australian regulators from perhaps regulators in a more authoritarian leaning environment. And it's a really important point that we just need to keep coming back to. Is there a right of appeal? Is there transparency in what the regulators are doing? And ensuring that we're building that in, to protect the Australian democratic process, that ultimately this all comes back to what is Australia and what is it that we stand for when we talk about, creating that future. Can
I just jump in on that, Johanna? I think that's a really important point to make, because I think the other part of it, in addition to the formal checks and balances and appeals, is how do we regulate? There's almost there's a sort of set of norms around regulators that have been around with us a long time, of knowing and having a degree of confidence that appropriate people will be appointed to regulators who will make judgments in an understood way, and that will, lead to outcomes that people have a degree of confidence in, and confidence that the pendulum's not swinging too wildly. That's really hard to get that confidence early on. And so but it's also really hard to write black and white binary choice rules for things you haven't yet seen. So building enough trust and having confidence that we've written the laws, and we are also need to accept that the regulators will judge reasonableness reasonably, it's tough, because from a business perspective, you'd be saying, well, this is all a little bit uncertain here. I don't know quite how a regulator's going to respond to incident X, or what their view of reasonable might look like. And in a sense, that sometimes that just takes a little while to evolve, but that's very difficult where the world's moving at sort of light speed, and norms develop and regulatory models develop at a slightly slower pace.
And Kate, did you have any thoughts on that? How we simultaneously build trust between all of the stakeholders in this ecosystem, creating those forums for non-adversarial, non-transactional discussion, but at the same time avoiding regulatory capture? What do you think some practical things we can do in this space might be?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's three things. I think that having good administrative procedures is vital, because they're the things that actually should be most constant and certain. And that actually benefits everyone, because as Richard said, often the most stressful thing from industry's point of view is not bad regulation, but uncertain regulation. Like, I actually get that. That is an issue raised to me more commonly actually than a complaint about the actual rule. It's that, say with the FIRB, reviews at the moment, legally they're supposed to be done in 30 days, but only 30% of the time is it ever done in 30 days. What's different in the Australian scheme is we have if it's not done in that time frame, unlike say the UK, we don't have subsequent clarity about what happens next. Like in the UK, you either by default get approved, or else you have an extension granted for a fixed period of time. If you disagree with that, there's a procedure to contest it. So for me, I think just, you don't want people to be arguing about procedure. You want procedure to be really certain and upfront. So getting that right, I think, is important. And I think that protects regulators from regulatory capture as well, because then they know exactly what procedure they have to follow to be fair. I think policy is often the piece where you need to have more flexibility, because the technology is changing, the outcomes you're solving for may be changing, the stakeholders may be changing business models. So that's the piece, I think, where the interaction, the collaboration is vital, and building those trusted relationships ahead of being in a heated policy debate is really vital. But that's a sort of continuous process, in a way, of continuously building those relationships, continuously updating your knowledge, continuously making sure you understand each other's objectives. And I think if we can get that balance right, it will help everyone. I would also just say on business models, I think the third thing I think we don't want to fix is our mindsets. Like, I struggle with this kind of concept of big tech a lot, because I look at my membership and I have almost no one in my membership that anyone would actually rationally consider to be big tech. But often I almost have to, some policy debates start with the presumption that big tech is the default, when it's often the exception. And there's not even one type of big tech. So I think, recognizing in Australia, for example, the thing that we excel at the most is enterprise software across the entire tech sector, from defense to space to everything else. It's the one part of our sector that is most continuously produced by value successful companies in the last 3 decades. It's enterprise software, which is a subscription model. It's usually very, in the nicest possible way, very boring. You're doing accounting software and payroll software. It's a very, very different culture to the one that people think of with big tech. And it has vastly different incentives, because if your customers are paying a fee for your service, the last thing you want to do is misuse their data, because the first thing they'll do is cancel their subscription. So it's an existential threat to your business when you're not managing these issues well. So I think, having that open mindset and not, industry not making presumptions about regulators, but regulators not making presumptions about industry is also really important to get the policy right. But then having that procedure fixed and certain and clear up front just gives everyone good parameters as they engage.
Yeah, and I certainly think the point you made, Kate, right at the start, that it's not bad regulation but uncertain regulation. That is something that there has been, that I have heard from a lot of the industry partners that we have consulted with through this process. I think bad regulation is probably often a focus of civil society and wanting to make sure that we are getting good regulation. And I don't mean to imply that you would ever condone bad regulation either, but it's an interesting way that the focus differs between industry, government, and consumers or NGO and those types of organisations. I think
the other important thing on that is the difference between bad regulation is one thing, which is very different from bad regulatory outcomes. And I think, to Kate's point, the idea of certainty, I sort of scribbled down as you were talking, it seems to me trust in a regulator kind of requires maturity on both sides, a degree of consistency, a degree of explicability of decisions, a degree of a willingness to exercise proportionality. But the key thing is it doesn't mean agreement. So it doesn't ultimately mean the industry and the regulators have to see eye to eye. That's in a sense where you avoid the capture. So yeah, I think it's boring process. Getting boring process right, as Kate says, not to argue about it, is really critical.
Yeah. Kate, do you want to jump in?
If we're allowed to agree this time, Richard, then I do agree on that. Without suggest there's any regulatory capture.
Awesome. Guys, I wanted to turn and please, I've been injecting comments and questions that people have made all through the session, but if you have any, please drop them in. I wanted to come back to the question here that's been put in the chat from John Lawrence. Partly this is self-interest because this is something that we're really focused on in part 2 of the report, but it also comes to Kate's point about the AI and data assurance example that you gave with the New South Wales government. So the question is, do we need something like the Office of Technology Assessment, which used to advise US Congress so that legislators were able to access impartial expert advice? So just for everyone's benefit, in the report that we had in part 1, we did propose a model. That model references and builds on, expands on this concept of the Office of Technology Assessment. We've looked at many different models internationally. And one of the things we'll be proposing in part 2 of the report is a model that builds on many of these elements, but also we've heard loud and clear from the people that we have consulted in the second round that we shouldn't just be creating new organisations for the sake of new organisations. So we're really trying to blend together the existing structures that we have to bring together ideas like this concept, Kate, of the AI and data assurance, that access to experts, increasing participation of civil society, consumers. The question of funding there is one that is a really important one. How do you actually, we can't just keep expecting organisations to turn up when the organisations, similar to NetThings, is done in a volunteer basis. How do we actually, get that participation in a meaningful way from those types of groups? So to the both of you, is there anything you think when, the tech assessment model didn't work, it ultimately failed and was wrapped up in the US. So do you think there is merit in this idea that John has put forward the question, and Kate, maybe yours is the more discrete example you were giving of the New South Wales system. So maybe I'll throw to you first.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think anything that can help, say, parliamentarians improve their technological literacy, recognizing that they're often having to review huge numbers of bills in really short order, can be valuable. And I think exploring ways to help them develop that literacy is useful. I don't have a fixed view on the right model. I think the US perhaps has also used fellowship models, for example, where they've had people cycle in and work in political offices for periods who've come from scientific or technical backgrounds. I think that program actually has been really well regarded and quite a success. So, obviously you still have the parliamentary library service there. So there might be ways that you can ensure they have people in their staff who can advise on these issues, beefing that up. There's probably multiple models for that question. But I think for me, when I think about the impact and risk of regulation, like the one thing that genuinely makes me feel in this job has genuinely caused me to have sleepless nights and feel stressed is illiteracy over data regulation and just the risk created. Like this sharing economy scheme, I've put a lot of thought into it because the rules say, the ATO can require huge ranges of businesses to collect potentially very sensitive personal data, bank account details, names, addresses, emails, everything we're sort of worrying about now. Lots of businesses who've never collected this before pass it on to the ATO every 6 months, and that the ATO might use this data to connect those data sets to other data sets they already hold to help them assess a person's individual tax liability and then pre-populate their tax form. This is how they've told me it's a use case. And as someone who worked in Dublin next where I came to this role, everything about that model has every single red flag going off for me on data governance, because that's such a sensitive use case. You're calculating a tax bill liability, and we know tax bills are a big trigger for bankruptcy. So you're pre-populating in a form, so no one knows, how it was calculated. So there's just a whole set of issues from an AI perspective around that use case. But to date, it has triggered zero red flags. It's legislation that's been passed. And then on the other side, this idea that we've got a huge new program requiring private sector companies to go out and collect all this data without really giving thought to whether, in most cases, the types of people whose data will now be even collected are even at risk of tax fraud. And yet we're going to kind of just kick off this big new program with no digital identity solution, no thought to how that data will be held and stored and for how long in those companies, and yet we want to start the scheme within about 12 months. Like everything about this for me right now is triggering a lot of angst and red flags, but there's no system in place. I feel like I shouldn't be the red flag. I shouldn't be the canary in the coal mine. There should be some system in place that has already identified these risks, that's kicking off, a really thoughtful, objective, independent assessment of that kind of program, and yet we have nothing. We've passed it with nothing, and that's why I say that AI and data assurance framework, which I think is thoughtful because it has lots of components, an independent group, a pre-agreed framework, a process for people coming back continuously to improve and design. I think if we did one thing in the next 12 months federally, putting that kind of model in place is helpful because it'll solve for a range of different policies, a range of different programs. It's like one instrumental intervention that I think stops us from having to solve each of these as single use cases.
Yeah. So you've given us your one magic wand thing you would like to change, and I'm going to allow Richard to respond, but also add to the response, Richard, if you had that magic wand, which I love to give people. I'm going to give a bit of a plug. We have a podcast called Tech Mirror, and I often give our guests the magic wand of if you could change one thing. So what would the one instrumental change that you think would make a really big difference? And then also this question of tech assessment, conscious that we're coming up to time as well and wanting to make sure that that we finish on time for the next panel.
Okay, so I'm not sure I've got a magic wand answer, and partly that's I'm going to play the humble public servant card and would hate to sort of preempt a great idea that ultimately might be entirely inconsistent with government policy. But just a couple of thoughts. Firstly, a couple of thoughts on the thing we've just been talking about. There is an interesting question. I think Kate's point about literacy is a really good one. What the model is, I don't know, and parliamentary literacy is an important thing. They are passing the laws, so how do they come up this curve? It sort of sounds like we're looking around. I don't know whether this is what John had in mind, but in a sense where, as Kate referred to the parliamentary library, the other observation I'd make is almost the parliamentary budget office kind of thing. So that question of literacy of lawmakers is interesting, and it's different, obviously, to literacy of government and literacy of public servants and literacy of regulators. On Kate's magic wand idea, I think that's really interesting. The thing that I would just want to make sure that we don't, the thing that in a scheme like that, if I understand it correctly, that we just need to avoid the temptation on the government side doing is to make sure we know what we're doing for industry in terms of giving them guidance or assistance or comments or, around design, for example. Is that a defence against a problem in the future? Is it a capacity to change it? Where does the assurer sit with respect to, well, what if someone follows all of the assurance, gets all of the assurance that every step they're taking is the right step to take, and then a problem occurs down the track? How do we, in a sense, protect everyone in that scenario for not, to make sure that we get the benefits of guidance and help and assistance and assurance on the way through, but don't sort of expose people at the far end? That's not very well explained, but I know
exactly what you're talking about. I think it's a really good point. And I'll clarify as well that this scheme, so the New South Wales government set it up. It's their sort of customer service department and digital department. So Ian Opperman, who leads their team, was one of the initiators of it, but within the context of the department. So they've set it up just for New South Wales government programs. So the first way that I think this would help federally is if the ATO is doing a big data program internally or any other agency, you have a sort of standard framework which tells you exactly the things that you should be thinking about up front, and then a really expert body that you can go and test it with. So that's putting aside policy. I think that's one very useful purpose for it, but noting that often that kind of program will be legislated, so there's a connection from the design of the policy through to the program delivery. I think the second purpose, which is not how it's used in New South Wales, but it struck me could be really useful, is to also be able to use it when you're thinking about designing regulation that invokes data collection or invokes the use of AI. Because actually the people on that panel have the same skill to tell the legislators, whether they think they've accurately captured the technologies they're using and the right risks.
Yeah. Kate, I'm going to have to jump in. I'm sorry, just because I know that there's a panel coming after us, before us. And as I expected, such a good conversation. Thank you to both yourself, Kate Pounder, and Richard Windeyer. Really delighted that you were able to join us for this conversation. Thanks for the great comments that came through. Couldn't agree with you more about the need for the connection between education of the tech providers, ethics, regulation. This is actually the mission of my centre, the Tech Policy Design Centre. Please keep an eye out for part 2 of our report, which is actually going to try and answer many of these unanswerable questions. Thank you so much, and best of luck with the remainder of the event. Looking forward to participating.
Thanks, Johanna.
Thanks, Johanna.
Having me. Tech Mirror is a podcast of the Tech Policy Design Centre at the Australian National University. This episode was produced on Ngunnawal lands by Jack Fox. Ben Gowdy provided invaluable research and post-production support. If you would like to support the pod, please give us a 5-star rating, or even better, leave us a short review. This really helps us to get the word out. We also love it when you send us questions or comments. We read them all. You can find out more by following us on Tech Policy Design on Twitter or LinkedIn, or Google Tech Policy Design Centre and follow the links. Thanks for listening. Get in touch and get involved.